Hello everyone, and welcome to our webinar titled Join the Winning Team by Integrating SAP and SharePoint. In this webinar, we will show you how to build complex workflows by leveraging and integrating Microsoft SharePoint and SAP without any programming. My name is Teresa Jackie, and I will be your host today. I will be going through a brief introduction of key performance indicators and an overview of the Windshuttle solution. I also on the line have Bill Wiseman. Bill is our solutions engineer, and he will be going through a product demonstration highlighting the features and the functionality of our product. Let's quickly run through the agenda of our webinar. First, we will introduce SharePoint and SAP and why integrating them by example use cases. Then we will do our Windshuttle workflow and forms demonstration, highlighting the features and the benefits. We'll have our summary, and we'll wrap up with any questions you may have. As a reminder, please use the question and answer box on your GoToMeeting control panel to ask any questions at any time. We'll do our best to answer it in real time. So let's go ahead and get started. So first I want to talk about why integrating SAP and SharePoint. So SAP is clearly the system of record for a mass majority of corporations, enterprises today. It is the ERP leader in terms of business functionality. It's proven, stable technology that companies use to run their business across the globe. It also has built up a large ecosystem of people that can supply, configure, and add to SAP, which is very helpful. It also has a lot of industry solutions. However, with this complexity also comes challenges. First is that SAP has a complex user interface, and this often leads to challenges for companies with getting data into SAP in a timely manner. As a result, it also affects the quality of data, which can interfere with the ability to make decisions. SAP also has numerous workflow tools within itself, but they're very difficult and technical to build and use. SAP workflow is not suitable for managing processes outside of SAP. And finally, SAP is only used by a limited number of employees in an organization. The average is about 20% of all employees in a large organization have SAP licenses. Well, on the other hand, we have SharePoint. It is becoming the enterprise portal of choice. In comparison to SAP, it has a simple web-based UI. It has a lot of collaboration tools within it. It is easy to configure and supported by IT. It is also easy to administrate. And like SAP, it has a large ecosystem of third-party vendors which could be called upon to help configure and adjust. Unlike SAP, it is licensed across the whole enterprise, so it is nearly touched by every user in the organization, and they have the ability to access a SharePoint site. Its model is collaborating both the business unit and IT to streamline business process development. On the downside, SharePoint is not an ERP system. It is not designed as a system of record. And while it does have some workflow capabilities, that too has its limitations. So if we can bring both SAP and SharePoint together and get the best of both worlds, we think there is a huge opportunity to leverage the best components of the two ecosystems. For example, with SAP and SharePoint integration, one of the greatest things is you can provide users with a single web-based entry point and store data within SAP system and expand the number of our participants of an SAP process because more people have access to their web-based interface. You can also leverage the investment of SAP and Microsoft SharePoint technologies that you've already made. And finally, you can improve business process and make your enterprise more efficient. When companies first start to engage us, they must uncover and answer one simple question. How are we doing it today, and does this process we have in place make sense for the future and the business of the company? Typically, when engaging with clients, we hear a number of different ways that they're doing workflows, and soon begin to discover that Windshuttle can solve the problems of being stuck in custom programming, which is expensive to develop, very costly to implement, paper-based workflows with no rich context for reporting, an email-based workflow with having the capabilities for any kind of approval or notification status, and also electronic workflows that are not robust and just are too simple or generic. So what is Windshuttle Workflow? What can it do? With Windshuttle Workflow, you can enforce virtually any business process with the capabilities to route documents and forms and electronic workflow, with the and also being able to see at a glance who did what and when. It gives you a timeline of where things are in the process, and from there you're able to dissect your process and workflow with generated reports and metrics. You can see where any bottlenecks reside and address them. Windshuttle Workflow makes it easy to adapt to changes in a business process, which we all know can happen quite frequently. It can decrease work time cycles and increase workplace efficiency. Also, it can help you get your product out to market quicker. Windshuttle Workflow provides an efficient, reliable, and cost-effective means to creating any virtual type role-based process without any software coding or consultant. Here's just a list of examples of where we've seen Windshuttle Workflow placed in some of our clients' environments. Some of you can relate to these processes, and keep in mind other processes that your company could be using to automate. Here's just an example of a new vendor request form. With Windshuttle Workflow, you have the capability to route this form through several approvals, change the view of this form for each person that touches it, and then ultimately load that information into SAP. So during our demonstration, Bill will be highlighting the best practices on using Microsoft Excel, web forms, and other popular platforms as your interfaces to automatically upload SAP data. Attendees today will learn how to enable business users to automate the integration of Microsoft SharePoint to accelerate workflows with no programming, and also show how Windshuttle can help automate virtually any SAP module and improve data quality in SAP by reducing manual data entry errors. So without further ado, so we can really highlight and dive into the features and the functionality of Windshuttle, I'm going ahead and pass the baton over to Bill Wiseman to go through our technical presentation of our Windshuttle solution.
All right, very good. Thank you, Teresa. And I'll just ask quickly if you can hear me and see my screen.
Absolutely, Bill.
All right, perfect. So thanks for the introduction. We're going to share a little bit about the Windshuttle workflow solution, which brings SAP or integrates SAP with your SharePoint environment. And so this afternoon, the demonstration will include a process. And first of all, I'm going to show you an end user example of the already built workflow and form solution, and we'll walk through the workflow scenario. So you'll kind of get an understanding as to how it looks from an end user perspective first. And then we'll walk through the process of how do we actually create these workflows and forms using the Windshuttle solution. So that process will entail recording a transaction. And recording a transaction is actually walking through an SAP transaction just like you normally would if you were manually doing it. And then we will use Windshuttle to map that to a form and publish a web service. Once that web service is published, and of course this is all done, all this lifting and heavy lifting is done by the Windshuttle solution. So you don't have to do anything. There's no programming, no development, no application approach to the solution. All that will be given to you. This web service will be stored on a common server, and then as a author or designer, we'll take that web service, we'll design a workflow, we'll design a form, and then we'll publish that integrated solution back into that SharePoint environment so that our end users have the capability of logging in and checking out the appropriate data templates or forms, or interacting with SAP in that format. So without any further ado, as Teresa would say, let's get to the demo. And so first, from an end user perspective, I'm going to open up the SharePoint environment. So this SharePoint environment, what this becomes is a central access point for all the users in your organization to access everything that's been created Wind Shuttle. It's a central access point. It's a central database. It is a central place to manage your workflow, so all your tasks will be available here in these lists. And it's also a place where we can add governance around these Wind Shuttle processes. So we can give our administrator very tight visibility and granular control over who's doing what, with what, when they're doing it, and how they're doing it, and giving our end users visibility to the processes at the same time. So this is our environment that we've created here, and I'm just going to log in, and we're going to start the process of running through a form. In this case, we'll pick Material Master. And so my user wants to create a new material in SAP. So it starts out with the process here. We could create it from scratch, or we could use a reference material in SAP. So in this case, I'll just choose a reference material. And then I'll put in some selection criteria. Now, what I'm going to be doing is looking into my SAP system. So I'm going to actually be communicating or querying my SAP system to retrieve some data out of the SAP database. So I want to see a range of materials with this particular kind of description here. And so when I communicate with SAP, that means that not only do I have a Wind Shuttle license, but I also have an SAP license assigned to this. So I query SAP. I get a list of possible candidates for my material. I select one. I'll choose a plant in order to create my new material. And then I'll say, okay, go out and read all the information around that master data record back into my form so I have a good starting point for my new material. So I'm using this material here with this data as my reference information. Now I'll just simply copy that information down to my new material, and then maybe you want to make some different choices or different selections or different descriptions in my new material master. I can do things like F4 lookup, so I can actually look into SAP, pull back the list of values, and drop them into my form. I can change any one of these particular fields in my transaction, as well as I have the capability of invoking validation. In other words, I can check the data in my template or form against SAP before I actually go through the posting process. So it takes it through the first step of that commit process in SAP without actually creating a record or changing a record. So we see that the data that our master data clerk has entered into the system is valid. Maybe there's some attachments that you want to associate, some PDFs, some drawings, vendor invoices, etc. And then we'll start it down the path of our workflow. In this case, we've got 5 or 6 different levels of workflow approval process and activities included here, and you'll see each one of these as we continue on through the process. Maybe I'll put in a note that says, please approve new material, and all this will be saved and associated with this particular record. Now, at this point, everything is being saved into the SharePoint database. We do have certain applications that allow us to do things like uploading to the SAP database, things like AP invoices, journal entries, etc. So as you were looking at the process, as I pointed out, there's several people in this workflow process. And the next two in the line of this workflow are the accountant and the plant controller. So let's open up the accounting data. But let's say, for instance, maybe the accountant was not at his workstation and maybe he's out in the field. So in that case, we can show you that there is integration with your Outlook environment, whereby you know, an accountant or someone of that nature could approve a particular transaction from their email device. So not only do they have visibility within their SharePoint environment, but through their email. So in this case, you'll notice that it's an accounting view. So as Teresa says, we can create different views for different processors throughout the workflow. So in this case, the accountant sees what's appropriate to the accounting department. And then they might enter in some information, and they could also check the validity of the data that they've entered into the system. If they wanted to, they could review any attachments at this point prior to passing it on through the workflow process. The next step in the process, this form goes to the plant controller. Now the plant controller will have an entirely different or separate view. So you can see we can take a transaction like a material create that might, in the case of a finished good, might have 25 or 30 different screens that we could possibly go into, and we can break those screens down and fields down based on, you know, the appropriate individual in our workflow process. So in this case, the plant controller sees, you know, plant controlling data, maybe makes some selections, validates their data, and then moves it along again to the next step in the process. So we've seen a couple of concurrent activities taking place here, and now it's going to move on to an approval step. So now it's going to go to the master data team for approval. Now the master data team, they can see the entire process. So the master data manager can see, you know, maybe the basic data, the plant controlling data, as well as the accounting data, view any associated attachments, read any notes, etc. We'll say the master data team approves it, and now it moves on to the final step in the process, which is to actually create that record in our SAP environment. So for final approval, again, we could do a validation check at this step, but I'll just go ahead and create the new material. So at the culmination of our workflow, we have that connection to bring all this data together from all those multiple participants and all those multiple views and create a new material in SAP 73708. So if we wanted to, we could jump into our SAP system, and we can look for material 73708, if my memory doesn't fail me. So let's go into MMO2 and 73708. And you can see here are the views that we selected. And if I wanted to actually go into display the changes, we'll just kind of see who did what. Now you can see that WS user 1, which was the person that was actually doing the participant there doing the changes, made all of these particular changes. Drill in there. And these are all the field changes that particular user made. All right. So that's how it looks from an end user perspective. Now what I want to do is, I'll just go ahead and finish up this process. I'll show you the audit trail that goes along with it, so we can see everything that has been captured along the way. It started with a material clerk, it went to the plant controller, the accountant added some data, master data governance team did the approval. It actually went to a group approval in this case, and WS user 1 was the user that actually created the record, did the approval, and then brought this process to an end. Okay, so now let's take a look at how we can easily, graphically, and non-programmatically create a scenario like this. So I'm going to start with, as I mentioned earlier, the creation of a transaction. So it simply starts like this. Now, for some of you on the phone, this or webinar, this could be kind of a review. So basically, the authoring process is the same regardless of how we deploy the solution. If we're using, Excel template, that's perfectly fine. If we are using, lost my cursor there. Losing your cursor. Okay. So, regardless of how you deploy it, whether it's an Excel template or whether it's a form, really the authoring process remains the same. I'm just going to go ahead and close down some of these screens so we don't have those interfering with us. And we'll log off of SAP. All right, so it launches us into the WinShuttle solution here, and now we'll start the process. And it's a three-step process: recording the transaction, mapping it to whatever interface we choose, and then giving it to our end user to run. So in this case, we're going to create a transaction that's going to automate a form. Get to the desktop. As many windows as I can. All right, so we're just going to do a basic material change here so that you'll understand the process. So any transaction, you could automate any transaction you wanted to here. So we'll just call this webinar, and then maybe I'll just change the weight and the weight unit for this particular material. Okay, and then once you're satisfied with your recording, whether that's a material or a vendor or a customer or a sales order or a journal entry or a purchase requisition, whatever it is, you'll just save that transaction. You created a change document in this case, and then we will, and then we start the process of mapping. So we start with the recording via the GUI, and then we'll map it. In this case, we're going to map to a form, and I'll show you how that works. So like I said, some of you may be familiar with the recording process. Some of you may not have seen any of this before. So as I said, it's a very graphical, non-programmatic approach. So what you see here is basically what you did in your recording. You went into the material, you changed the description, the weight, unit, gross weight, net weight, so forth. If you take a kind of a more expert view of it, you can see the screens that you went into and the fields that you touched in those screens. And then you can see there's some fields that I didn't use during my recording. But if I wanted to at this point, I could enable any of those fields. So now to the mapping. So if I were doing something like an Excel template, I could just simply do a drag and drop of this particular transaction. So I'm just grabbing these fields and mapping them to my Excel template. Now, if that would be the case if we were going to do a mass load. In this case, we're going to do a form, so we're going to change the format to XML. We're going to save our transaction. And I'll just save that. All right. So once we do that, we've created our transaction. Now the next step in the process, as I mentioned, is to publish a web service. So I'm just going to open up my transaction here. And basically what you're going to see is, and I'll just open it in a production state. And so basically what you see here is the capability of publishing a web service. So we can give our web service a name, a description at this point, and then we'll publish it. All right, so once we publish that, we're ready to take that transaction and to design our form and our workflow. So what you're seeing here is another one of our solutions that's called Designer. And this allows me to create that integrated solution. And so I'll just start the process by saying I want to create a new workflow for forms. I'll determine where I want my forms to sit, and now I'm ready to start with my design. And so basically what you see here to the left is a clean canvas or palette, you might say, with a couple of workflow lanes by default already created. If we wanted to, in this case, maybe we want to go ahead and add, a few more participants to the process. So you could just simply add, let's say in this case, for our scenario today, maybe we want to add a manager. And so I'm just going to give the manager a name, assigning to an approval group, and say OK. All right, so now we have an originator, the process owner, who really just has visual capability, and then we have the manager, who in this case we're going to use for an approver. All right, so a few steps that we have to take here. One, we want to bring that transaction into this solution, and we want to then generate a form, and then we want to design that form. And then there is the capability during this to kind of manage the life cycle of the solution. So during the development of our solution, we can create, maintain, and change and retain different versions of our solution prior to it coming to a production status. So, maybe your form changes, maybe, that we have workflow changes, and we want to capture those throughout this development process. So you have that capability. Up here, what we need to do is first we want to bring in our transaction. So I'm just going to bring in our recording of our transaction. And then what we want to do is we want to generate from that the form. So I'm going to add my web service. So remember, after I did my recording, I generated a web service. We'll assign it to a group and say OK. And what happens is it takes that recording and it instantiates it here in this panel. And now I can just say, OK, generate a form for me. All right. So in the background, it just generated the shell of an InfoPath form. And so now what we're left to do with is to design that form, and we're going to design our workflow. And then we're going to publish that so that our end users will have it available to them to consume. We want to determine our development profile here. So here is where our SharePoint form will sit. This is the governance site for this particular process. And so we'll just go here. We'll assign our transaction to a particular SAP system. And we are pretty much all systems go. So now we'll design our form. Let me just save our solution. And we'll launch into the Forms Designer. So what you're going to see over here to the right really is, again, the fields of the recording instantiated here in the Forms Designer. So we're just going to start out by saying we need to create a material change form, and I'm just going to bring in my fields here, just like this. We could, I'm going to delete these fields, but if we wanted to, we could insist that each one of our SAP users manually keys in their credentials as they go through the process, or we can assign this, or we can store the credentials here within the solution that will be called once we call that web service from our form. So we've designed our form. I pulled in my log field information, and really all that's left to do now is to add a bit of the controls, really kind of the secret sauce that WinShuttle brings to this process. And the first is the process control. And what that allows me to do is really to publish this integrated forms workflow solution when we get to the culmination of the design. And also, I want to be able to call the web service, so I'm going to add the web service control. So the web service control allows me to call that web service that we just published after we recorded that form. So I'm going to say, okay, I need to call this particular web service, and here it is again. And I'm going to say, when we press this web service button, I want you to post this transaction to SAP. And I'll just go ahead and apply that. So I've given it a title. I've put in the fields of my particular form. I've added the process control and the ability to call a web service. I added the log field. If we wanted to, we could create multiple views here for our solution, but I'm just going to go ahead and save it, close it, and now we're ready to start with the design of our workflow. All right, so let's save our process and start with the workflow design. Again, when we were doing the recording of the transaction and the mapping of the transaction, that was a very graphical approach to design. When we instantiated the web service within the form designer, you saw me drag and drop, and it was a very graphical approach. All these functions have already been created for you by the solution, and the same is true here. Here are all your functions. This is where we start. This is where we end. Here's a particular workflow activity, an approval step. If there are things like plugins that you may have that may go outside of the system, maybe to do something like check a Dun & Bradstreet credit check on or approval, we would plug those in here. If there's a loop, and what I mean by a loop is if there's maybe a sub-process by which it proceeds through the workflow, it might be approved or rejected. Maybe upon rejection, it's returned to the originator to correct before it starts the process again. There's email notification, you've seen that, and just a multitude of services that have already been defined here. So we're going to start with the person, we'll say the material clerk in this case is going to make the change to the material, and then we're going to make it a pretty simple, straightforward process. It's going to go to the manager for approval before the process comes to an end, and maybe we add an email notification. Maybe we add a couple of potential routes. One could be from the manager back to the originator to let the originator know that it's been approved and created, or in the same case, maybe we want it to notify the originator that it was rejected and the new material was not changed. In that case, it would seem pretty logical that you might just have a loop where it would go back to the originator to correct those changes and start the process again. So I've created a simple workflow. We've designed our form. I'll just go ahead and save this particular process. Let's see. I think that pretty well takes care of that. I'll just save this. And now we're ready to publish our solution. So when we publish our solution, what it's going to do is it's going to take this form that we've designed, take this integrated workflow that we've designed, and publish this out to our SharePoint site. So now I'll come back out to my SharePoint site. I'll do a quick refresh, and now I should be able to see my new process that I just created. So here we start it up, and here's my material change form. So we'll just start with changing our material, put some new descriptions in it, maybe change, the weight unit. And in this case, maybe I won't post it in the first step. I'll select an approver. Now, just as a note, these approvers, these roles, these participants in this process, all that can be a very automated process. There can be groups of approvers where you could select from a list. You could have this workflow routed based upon a particular object. Maybe, material type might send it to this approver, and a separate material type may send it to an entirely different approver. So we'll just go ahead and save and route it. So we'll just follow through this simple process that we created. Here is our manager approval. In this case, we really didn't change the views, and we'll just say the manager has the capability of actually calling the transaction and posting the transaction or making the changes to this particular record. And so now we can see that this particular record was changed in SAP, finished by approving the process, and then there again we can see the entire workflow. We can see, in this case, I've taken the view of the form. I can see the material that was changed, and I can see each and every participant in the process with a time date stamp and exactly what they did throughout the workflow process. So in a nutshell and in review there, what we did today was we created an SAP transaction. We recorded it. From that, we created or published a web service, which really is just an HTML version of that transaction. We then consumed that web service in our form. We designed a form. We then designed a workflow with a very graphical approach to including the functions. And then we published that integrated workflow and form back into this SharePoint environment so that you can see the connectivity between the SharePoint environment and SAP is automated via the WinShuttle solution. So with that, I am going to turn it back over to Teresa. And Teresa, if there's any questions or anything like that from the attendees today, I'll be glad to handle any of those.
Perfect. Yeah, we have a couple of questions here, Bill. So let's go ahead and dive into the first one. What versions of SharePoint is WinShuttle compatible with?
Okay, so we're currently compatible with SharePoint 2010 and 2013. So we are up to date with the latest version.
Perfect. And also we run on all flavors of WinShuttle too, or down to the free version to the enterprise version.
That is correct.
Yep. And our next question is, does WinShuttle have conditional routing capabilities?
Yes, they do. So within the design of the transaction itself, after we finished the recording, we then went into the mapping phase. So at this point, what we can do in the mapping phase is tell, based on a particular logic, if a certain value maybe exists in a field that we've populated, then route that transaction based upon how we populated that particular field. So we can create some conditional logic in the mapping phase of the transaction.
Perfect. And our next question, are government agencies using WinShuttle?
That's a good question. I know that there are several government contractors, civilian government type organizations that are using the Wind Shuttle solution. I'm not completely sure about the integration of SharePoint and Forms to any government agencies, but I will tell you that there are a lot of organizations out there, large organizations, that security is of the utmost concern, where there are, patent concerns and things like that. We have several customers like that that are using and embracing the Wind Shuttle solution.
Perfect. And someone asked if there is a recording available, and I can go ahead and take that answer. Yes, there is. We're recording this whole webinar, and we'll be sending that out, post this evening or by early tomorrow. You should have that in your email. We'll be emailing that out to everyone.
Yes, so Teresa, just one more comment on that last question, and it's something that I didn't specifically point out, but remember, regardless of how you use Wind Shuttle or how you deploy Wind Shuttle, it completely adheres to the security that you've established in your SAP environment. So any user roles, the profiles you've established, the authorizations that you've given to your individual users to the field level will completely be adhered to. There's no way using the Wind Shuttle solution to circumvent SAP security. So that's a very strong point when we're talking about security. Now, in addition to that, as I mentioned, we can add another governance layer on top of that via this SharePoint environment. So I can set very granular procedures and policies. I can say, Teresa cannot use this particular transaction between these particular hours and this particular day of the month. So I can be very granular and control what my users are doing. And remember, I still have the SAP Audit Trail, and I also have the Audit Trail that would be captured in Wind Shuttle and in the SharePoint environment. And then there's the SharePoint security. So based on my logon credentials for these forms, I can only see what's appropriate for me.
Perfect. And thank you, Bill. It looks like that's all the questions that we have for today. We'd like to thank everyone for your time today, and I hope you enjoyed our webinar. And like I said, we will be providing a recording to everyone who attended today. And have a great rest of your day. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.